All right, hello everybody. Local 5 Digital Manager Josh Rose. I'm here with reporter Justin Razavi.
Hello, everybody.
We're here to do the story behind the story on his piece that's airing Thursday. So tell me a little bit about the story that you did.
Sure. Well, we've done shorter stories on this before, Josh. Basically, in a nutshell, there are convicted sex offenders who, when they are released from prison, they are under the care of the state, and they're being placed out of their home county. So basically, a person can be convicted of a sex crime in, say, Milwaukee County, and then end up placed in Shawano County. And there was a law that was passed actually earlier this year by Governor Scott Walker, signed it into law, called Act 184, and it was supposed to prevent that from happening. However, some of these offenders are still getting placed. So when I was doing a story a few weeks ago in Fond du Lac County, and then I did another one before that in Shawano County, where I was seeing these offenders that are being placed despite Act 184 being a law, I wanted to dig in and see how judges are able to do this. So that's basically what led me to do this story.
All right. For those unfamiliar, could you tell us in a nutshell, what is Act 184, just quite simply?
Sure. So Act 184 says that anybody who's a sexually violent person, anybody who's been committed of a crime like sexual assault, that whenever they're released from prison, they after they're released from a mental health facility and from prison, when they've completed treatment at the facility after their prison time, Act 184 says that they can only be placed in their home county. So, for example, if somebody committed a crime in Milwaukee, served their prison time, got treated in a mental health facility, they would have to be placed in Milwaukee County. They couldn't be placed elsewhere in the state. The idea is that somebody commits a crime that they can't be sort of put in another community.
Okay, and that's the whole premise of the story, is this act, and with that act, they're not allowed to be moved elsewhere, but they are being moved elsewhere.
Well, see, it all comes down to different judges are interpreting this act differently. And we go into that in the story. If you guys haven't watched the story, you should definitely watch it. I go into detail and explain the different stages of this process of somebody going from being convicted as a sex offender to being released from prison and going into a mental health facility, and then being released for supervised release, where they're still under the care of a state, but they're in a house that the Department of Health Services leases. Basically, there's language in Act 184 that kind of leaves it up in the air as to who is at what stage an offender is under Act 184 or not. So, for example, there are some judges that think that Act 184 applies to offenders that are at an early stage of their supervised release, as opposed to some judges think that Act 184 only applies to offenders that have already been placed in a house. So, for example, let's just say an offender requests a supervised release, right? The whole process to get placed might take a year or so. So there are some judges that will say the second that an offender makes that request, they're not bound by Act 184. Some judges would say that they are. So, for example, Preston Renamaki, who was placed in Fond du Lac County, he had requested and had court hearings already, and so the judge in his case had said, you know what, he's already, his process has sort of started, so Act 184 doesn't apply to him because he'd already put that petition in before Act 184 had passed. So these guys that are in limbo, that have already put their requests in but haven't been placed yet, there's a few dozen of these guys in the state that are in limbo, and judges are sort of offering different opinions as to where these few dozen guys that are limbo, if Act 184 applies to them or not.
So if I can ask, does that mean after a certain amount of time, people will know, for lack of a better term, people won't necessarily be grandfathered into this? Will
Sure.
there be a cut
Sure.
line where 184 will be a hard line situation that this will never be an issue again, or is this going to be a continuing problem over the course of time?
Sure. Well, presumably, I mean, judges can interpret, the legislators write the law and the judges interpret it, so judges can interpret the law differently, but it makes sense to me that after a few years, after these few dozen guys that are in limbo, after they're placed, Act 184 should be pretty hard line, and anybody that hadn't put a request in before Act 184 was signed in March wouldn't be able to be placed out of county. So Act 184 doesn't apply retroactively. So if an offender's already been placed before Act 184 went into effect, they're staying put. If they haven't made a request yet, then Act 184 is going to apply to them if they ever get released. They can only stay in their own home county. But there's a few dozen of these guys that are sort of in limbo. They've put the request in. They're having court hearings before Act 184 went into effect, and so that's kind of up in the air as to.
So these people, the sex offenders, they're being placed into these 12 or so that are in this limbo. They're being placed in communities that they didn't actually commit the crime. So they're going into to just normal neighborhoods where people are going about their
People
way
don't
of
know
life.
that. And some of the theory, some of the lawyers, the district attorney I spoke with, she said the theory is that a sex offender might be more likely to reoffend if they're around strangers, but maybe if they're in their home community, they're going to play by the rules.
They may know, so they may be connected.
They have a support
so
system. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So Preston
Fascinating.
Renamaki, who was placed in the town of El Dorado on Nitschke Road, he's actually from Racine County, over an hour away, and
He's in Fond du Lac now.
He's in Fond du Lac County, and he's 2 houses down from.
But he's from Racine.
But he's from Racine County.
So who did you talk to about this?
Sure.
Who do you interview?
Well, I interviewed a family that has 4 small children that lives 2 houses down from Preston Renamaki. They've got 4 children aged 1 through 9. And
2 houses down.
Two
and
houses
they're just
down.
a family that
About
lived there
1,000 feet away.
however the case is. They've lived in this home, they've gone about their business, then out of nowhere 2 houses down comes in a sex offender living in their area that's not even from their area.
And they've dealt with this for 8 years. They've had offenders come in and out, and so they're kind
Why
of
they're there for 8 years.
well, that's where the Department of Health Services is leasing a property. So it's and the law does in the state of Wisconsin does say that an offender, whether they're and this has always been the case, or it's been the case for a long time, an offender can't be placed next to a house with small children, but the Rickards are 2 houses down, so it's technically is legal. So they're just kind of fed up with it. There's a gentleman that's going around with a petition in the area, trying to get people to sign the petition to deliver a petition with, he's hoping to get 2,000 or more signatures and deliver that to the Department of Health Services in hopes that they'll end that lease at that house, because a lot of people there don't agree.
So the reason these people keep getting placed in that particular home is because the Department of Health Services has a lease on that home.
Correct.
So the way that they're hoping, at least in the short term, well, for them long term, for this to go away in their specific environment would be for that home to no longer be the property of the state.
Sure,
correct.
And the thing is, I talked to the Rickards, and they said, they agree that offenders should be placed somewhere, but don't think it should be near children. They think that there's all kinds of rural places in Wisconsin that.
Do you cover that? Do you cover maybe where they could go to get beyond this problem, or what kind of stuff did you learn about that?
Sure. Well, basically, as far as where offenders can be placed, they can be as long as the DHS isn't breaking the law by where they place them. The DHS can place them anywhere that they own or rent a property at, and they own properties and lease properties throughout the state. So, in this case, they're technically not breaking the law, because the judge in Racine County says that Preston Renamaki put his request in for supervised release before Act 184 was signed into law by Governor Walker. So the judge said, look, he requested it before Act 184 went into effect. So even though he hadn't been placed yet, they're saying that he's that they're not breaking the law. So Fond du Lac County's been fighting it. I talked to, and if you guys watch the story, you'll hear from the Corporation Council of Fond du Lac County. You'll hear from the sheriff of Fond du Lac County. They've been fighting this for years. They're fed up. And the gentleman who's signing this petition is hoping to end offender housing on Nitschke Road there in Fond du Lac County. Now, if there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it is, Josh, I think as you implied, that eventually all these guys in limbo will be placed, and so Act 184 should be pretty ironclad from then on out. So hopefully a few years from now, this isn't going to be happening anymore once there aren't really any loopholes or any ways around being able to place offenders outside of their home county and it be congruent with law. So
interesting. Wow, what a story.
Yeah,
what a story.
And it's I feel like we live in a very nice area. There's I live in Green Bay. You live in the Fox Cities. Very low crime here. This is one of the few things I've seen here that's really kind of made me raise my eyebrow when I heard about it. So I wanted to dig deep into it. And like I said, I've talked with courts downstate. I've talked with the Department of Health Services. I've talked with law enforcement. I've talked with families who are affected by it. So we really put a lot of time and effort into this, into really just sort of seeing this issue and fleshing this issue out a little bit more than we have in our other stories that we've covered that were a little bit shorter.
Sure. Okay. And then one last thing before we go. So for the people out there watching, and this is just a direct question because I'm not even quite sure myself. Is there something they can do if this is something that they become interested? If this is something that they find some kind of a reason to get involved, whatever the case is. Is there a course of action? Is there a get involved button? Is there something that they can do to?
Well, it
to
is.
be a
I
part
mean,
of the
it
fight?
is kind of hard to fight judges. I mean, some of these orders are coming down from judges, so that is kind of hard. But what they can do is they can sign the petition, which we'll have a link. We have a link in the article that this is in right now, to where you can sign that petition. Again, the gentleman's name is Dan Degner. He's going to take that petition to the Department of Health Services, and in hopes that they end the sex offender housing on Nitschke Road. The second thing you can do is write your legislator. Part of the reason that judges are able to do this is because Act 184 really isn't specific enough. The vagueness of it allows judges to be able to find certain cases where they can release offenders out of county, and it violates kind of the spirit of Act 184, but it technically doesn't violate the letter of Act 184. So you can always write your legislator and ask that they make this Act 184, that they flesh out the specifics of it. So the more short-term action would be signing the petition, and like I said, there's a link to that in this article.
Excellent, excellent. And just so everybody knows too, by a simple Google search, you can access databases that'll tell you if a sex offender lives near you or anywhere in your community. It'll show you where they live, so you can at least be more informed to where they are if you have a family or if that's something that concerns you. Justin, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Thanks a lot.
Hope you guys like the story.
Thank you.